Hidden crime stories. The Menendez brothers' story. The 911 call came in just after midnight. A young man's voice, breathless, shaking, on the edge of something that sounded like genuine hysteria. Someone killed my parents. The address was a mansion on Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, the kind of street where the houses sit behind gates and hedges, where the silence at night is the expensive kind, purchased and maintained and rarely interrupted. When police arrived, they found a scene of almost unimaginable violence. Jose Menendez, an entertainment executive, and his wife Kitty, sitting in their den, killed by repeated shotgun blasts at close range. The room was devastated. The violence had been extensive, personal, and overwhelming. Their two sons, Lyle, 21, and Erik, 18, were the ones who had called it in. They told police they had been out that night, had come home, and discovered the bodies. They were distraught, inconsolable. Two young men whose entire world had just been violently taken from them. For months, the Beverly Hills Police Department treated this as exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. A brutal, professional-style execution. Perhaps a mafia hit. Perhaps something connected to Jose Menendez's business dealings in the entertainment industry. The boys were treated as grieving victims. They were given access to their parents' estate. They spent enormous sums of money in the months that followed. On cars, on watches, on a restaurant business, on the kind of spending that looks, in hindsight, almost impossible to misread. At the time, it was simply read as the behavior of two young men processing unimaginable grief in the way that wealth allows. Then, months later, everything changed. Erik Menendez had been in therapy with a psychologist named L. Jerome Oziel. And in one of those sessions, recorded, though Erik did not know it at the time, he told his therapist something that would unravel everything. He and his brother had killed their parents. This is the story of what happened inside that house on Elm Drive. It is the story of two trials, separated by years, that asked America to consider a question it was not prepared to answer. What do you do when the victims and the perpetrators occupy the same bodies? It is also, as of this very year, a story that is still being written. Because in May 2025, just months before this episode was produced, a judge did something almost nobody expected. He gave Erik and Lyle Menendez a chance to walk free. On Hidden Crime Stories, we are going to walk through every layer of this case. Not to tell you what to believe, but to give you everything. The violence, the allegations, the trials, and the question that this case has forced America to sit with for over 3 decades. This is not a simple story. It never has been. Stay with me. Beverly Hills, California, the 1980s. Jose Menendez had built a life that, from the outside, looked like the fulfillment of an immigrant success story taken to its most extreme conclusion. He had come to the United States from Cuba as a teenager, fleeing political upheaval, and through relentless ambition had climbed to the highest levels of the entertainment industry, eventually becoming an executive at RCA Records, a man credited with discovering and developing major recording artists. He was, by every external account, a man of total control, controlling of his career, controlling of his finances, and, as would become the central, devastating argument of his son's defense, controlling of his children in ways that, if true, were almost incomprehensibly dark. Kitty Menendez had been a beauty queen in her youth, a woman whose life had taken a trajectory she had not necessarily chosen for herself. By the late 1980s, those who observed the family described a woman who seemed worn down by alcohol, by the pressures of maintaining an image of wealth and stability, by a marriage that outside observers sensed was deeply unhappy beneath its polished surface. Lyle Menendez, the older son, was attending Princeton University, where he had been suspended for academic dishonesty. He was, by most descriptions, the more dominant of the two brothers, assertive, controlling in his own right, someone who had clearly absorbed and was now beginning to replicate some of his father's patterns of behavior. Erik Menendez, the younger son, was a competitive tennis player with ambitions of going professional. Those who knew him during this period described someone who seemed quieter, more emotionally fragile than his older brother, someone who appeared to be searching for an identity separate from the immense pressure of his family's expectations. What was happening inside that house on Elm Drive, behind the gates, behind the wealth, behind the image of a family that had achieved the American dream in its most literal form, was something that the public would not begin to understand until years after the murders themselves. The defense the Menendez brothers presented at their first trial in 1993 was unlike almost anything American courts had seen before at that scale of public attention. Erik and Lyle did not deny killing their parents. They had never denied it, not from the moment the truth came out. What they argued instead was that they had acted out of genuine, justified terror, that years of sustained abuse by their father, abuse that they said included sexual abuse beginning in early childhood and continuing into their teenage years, had left them in a state of psychological siege so severe that on the night of the killings they genuinely believed their parents were about to kill them first. This was the foundation of what became known as imperfect self-defense. The legal argument that even if the danger was not objectively real in that exact moment, the defendants genuinely and reasonably believed it was, based on a sustained pattern of trauma that had distorted their perception of danger itself. The brothers testified in detail and at length about the abuse they said they endured. Erik described incidents beginning when he was a young child. Lyle described a similar pattern and also described an incident in which he confronted his father about what was happening to his younger brother, only to become, he said, a victim of the same abuse himself. The prosecution's case told an entirely different story. They argued that the abuse allegations were fabricated, constructed after the fact by two calculating young men who understood that a defense built on victimhood was their only path to avoiding the harshest possible sentence. They pointed to the brothers' behavior in the months following the murders. The spending, the lack of visible grief that matched the violence of the crime, the inconsistencies in their initial statements to police. They argued that the true motive was simpler and far less sympathetic than abuse, money. Jose Menendez had a substantial estate. He had also, prosecutors argued, been growing increasingly controlling and critical of his sons as adults, threatening, in their account, to cut Lyle and Erik out of his will. The prosecution's theory was that the brothers killed their parents not in self-defense against ongoing abuse, but in cold, calculated anticipation of an inheritance they feared losing. The first trial, with two separate juries hearing the brothers' cases simultaneously, ended in 1994, with both juries deadlocked. Mistrials were declared. The retrial that followed in 1995 was dramatically different. Much of the defense evidence about alleged sexual abuse was excluded during the second trial. The judge significantly restricted what the defense could present. Without the same evidentiary latitude they had in the first trial, the brothers' legal team was forced to mount a narrower defense. In October 1995, the retrial began with a single jury. In March 1996, jurors convicted both brothers of first-degree murder. In July 1996, the brothers were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For nearly 3 decades, that appeared to be the final chapter of this story. It was not. For most of the 1990s and 2000s, the Menendez case existed in American cultural memory as something closer to a settled question. Two wealthy young men who killed their parents for money and tried, unsuccessfully, to hide behind a fabricated abuse defense. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence was life without parole. The story, as far as most of the country understood it, was finished. What changed that understanding was a combination of two things happening almost simultaneously. In May 2023, attorneys for the Menendez brothers asked the court to reconsider the conviction and sentence in light of new evidence, including testimony from a former member of the boy band Menudo who said he was raped by Jose Menendez when he was 14 years old, and a letter that Erik had written about his father's abuse prior to the killings. This new evidence mattered enormously because it was not coming from the brothers themselves. It was independent corroboration, from someone with no apparent motive to lie on their behalf, of a pattern of behavior by Jose Menendez that aligned directly with what Erik and Lyle had described on the witness stand decades earlier and had been largely disbelieved for. In September 2024, Netflix released a 9-episode dramatized series about the killings, which reignited massive public attention on the case. Millions of viewers who had no living memory of the original trials were introduced to the story for the first time, and the cultural conversation about sexual abuse, trauma, and how survivors are believed or disbelieved had shifted dramatically in the years since 1996. Then Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon announced his office was reviewing the new evidence, and in October 2024, Gascon announced that his office would formally recommend that the brothers be resentenced, citing a renewed understanding of and empathy for sexual abuse victims in light of how much public and legal understanding of trauma had evolved. Since the original trials, family members held a news conference pleading for the brothers' release, describing decades of advocacy from inside the family for a re-examination of the case that had taken extraordinary courage, given how publicly painful that advocacy had to be. This is where the case entered territory that almost no major American murder case has ever occupied. A conviction that had stood for nearly 30 years was being actively reconsidered, with the support of a sitting district attorney, on the basis of evolving understanding around trauma and abuse. What followed was a legal process more complicated, contested, and dramatic than almost anyone could have predicted. Before we go any further, I need to stop for just one moment. This case is asking something different of you than almost anything else we have covered on this channel. If it is making you think, if you find yourself genuinely uncertain about what you believe, take 5 seconds right now and subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories. Every single week we bring you cases exactly like this one, told with the full complexity they deserve. We have something extraordinary coming in the weeks ahead that you do not want to miss. Subscribe right now, and let's get back to that courtroom, because what happened next changed the entire trajectory of this case. The path to resentencing was not simple or uncontested. In late 2024, before Gascon's term as district attorney ended, a new DA named Nathan Hochman took office and inherited the case. Hochman approached the resentencing recommendation with far more skepticism than his predecessor had shown. Hochman opposed the resentencing and made attempts to withdraw from Gascon's recommendation, which were unsuccessful. The resentencing hearing was scheduled, postponed due to the impact of LA County wildfires on preparation time, and eventually rescheduled for March 20 and 21, 2025, though the proceedings ultimately extended further as the court worked through preliminary motions. On April 11, 2025, Judge Michael Jessic ruled that the resentencing hearings could continue despite Hochman's opposition, citing a 2023 California law that gives courts authority to recall a sentence and initiate resentencing proceedings at any point. One of the most striking elements of the resentencing hearing was a piece of evidence that Hochman's office presented in opposition, a pair of comprehensive risk assessments conducted by the State Parole Board that found the brothers would pose a moderate risk of violence if released, along with disclosures that both brothers had committed cell phone violations while in prison. Lyle in November 2024, and Erik in January 2025. During testimony, the brothers' cousin, Anna Maria Baralt, acknowledged under questioning that some of her conversations with Lyle had taken place on an illegal burner phone he had access to in prison. Despite that evidence, and despite the moderate risk assessment, the defense presented an extensive case for the brothers' rehabilitation over their decades of incarceration. The brothers had founded a long list of prison programs, with Erik starting at least 5, including a support group for disabled and elderly inmates. The defense argued in essence that, whatever the truth of the original crime, the men who had spent over 3 decades in prison were not the same people who had committed it. On May 13, 2025, Judge Jessic resentenced Erik and Lyle Menendez to 50 years to life in prison, making them immediately eligible for parole. During the hearing, Jessic was careful to clarify that he was not suggesting the brothers should be immediately released, but rather that one day they should have the opportunity to make their case. It was a watershed moment, not a guarantee of freedom, but a door opened for the first time in nearly 30 years. The resentencing was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one that, as of the recording of this episode, has still not reached its conclusion. Following the May 2025 resentencing, the brothers became immediately eligible for parole, and in August 2025 they appeared virtually before a parole board, with hearings scheduled for August 21st and 22nd respectively. The hope, for the brothers' family and supporters, was that the parole board would weigh the decades of documented rehabilitation, the programs they had founded, the support they had organized for vulnerable fellow inmates, alongside the original circumstances of the crime, and find a path toward release. After a 10-hour hearing, a panel of officials found that Erik Menendez was not suitable for parole. In August 2025, the brothers' first bids for parole were denied. It was a devastating setback for a family that had spent years building toward this moment. In September 2025, a judge separately rejected the brothers' habeas petition for a new trial, closing off, at least for now, an entirely different legal avenue the defense had pursued in parallel with the resentencing and parole process. So where does that leave Erik and Lyle Menendez as of today? They remain in prison. They remain eligible for parole, with future hearings still ahead of them. They are no longer serving a sentence of life without any possibility of release, but they have not yet been granted the release that resentencing made possible. They occupy a strange and unresolved legal space, neither condemned to die in prison, nor confirmed to ever leave it. Their family continues to advocate publicly and persistently for their release, citing the new corroborating evidence about their father's pattern of abuse, the brothers' extensive efforts at rehabilitation, and the simple, sustained argument that 35 years is enough. The family of Jose and Kitty Menendez who oppose release, and there are family members on both sides of this question, continue to argue that no amount of rehabilitation changes the fundamental fact of what happened in that den on Elm Drive in August 1989. Two parents killed by their own sons in an act of overwhelming and repeated violence. Both of those positions are held, right now, by people who loved Jose and Kitty Menendez. That is the reality of this case that no documentary, no trial, and no resentencing hearing has ever fully resolved. Before I give you my final thoughts, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. This is a story without an ending yet. Erik and Lyle Menendez are still in prison today, still eligible for future parole hearings, still living inside a question that this country has been arguing about for over 3 decades. If this story moved you, if it left you uncertain, or if you found yourself landing firmly on one side, please leave a comment below right now. Tell me where you stand. Tell me what part of this case stayed with you, and when the next parole hearing happens, and it will, we will be here to cover it. Subscribe right now so you don't miss that update. If someone in your life needs to hear this story, share it with them tonight. Now, here is what I want you to carry from everything we just walked through. I want to be honest with you about something. The same way I was honest about the Luigi Mangione case. This is not a story with a clean moral shape. It is not a story where the audience is meant to leave with a simple verdict in their hearts, the way we might after telling you about a man who buried bodies under his house or used a badge to hunt his neighbors. This is a story about two things that are both, simultaneously, completely true. Jose and Kitty Menendez were killed by their own sons in an act of devastating, repeated violence. They did not get to grow old. They did not get to see who their children became. Their deaths were violent and final, and they deserve to be remembered as victims of a real and terrible crime, regardless of what led to it. And also, there is now independent, corroborated evidence that did not exist in any form the original juries could consider, suggesting that Jose Menendez may have caused immense and sustained harm to his own children for years before his death. If that is true, then Erik and Lyle Menendez are not simply killers. They are also, in some real sense, victims of the people they killed. Holding both of those truths at once is uncomfortable. It does not resolve into a clean answer, and that discomfort is, I think, the most important thing this case has to teach us. We want our true crime stories to have a clear shape, a monster and a victim, a villain, and someone we can root for without complication. Most of the cases we have told on this channel have that shape, and it is part of why they are so powerful and so clear. The Menendez case refuses that shape. It asks something harder of us. It asks us to hold grief for two people who were killed by their own children, and to simultaneously hold space for the possibility that those children were responding, however wrongly, however violently, to something that had already been done to them for years. Here is what I believe. Honestly, after researching this story, the legal system exists to answer a narrower question than the moral one. The legal system asks, did these two men kill their parents? And under what legal framework should that be judged? The answer to that question, established by 2 trials and reaffirmed through every appeal since, is yes, they did it, and the law has held them responsible for it. But the moral question, the human question, is broader than that. It asks us to consider what we owe people who were harmed as children, even when the harm they carry forward becomes harm they cause to others. It asks us to consider what rehabilitation actually means, And whether 35 years inside a system, building programs to help other vulnerable people, constitutes a different person than the one who pulled a trigger in 1989. I do not think this channel's job is to tell you the answer to that question. I think our job is to make sure you have the full story, the violence, the allegations, the corroborating evidence, the decades of appeals, the family members who stand on opposite sides of this and have for 30 years, so that whatever conclusion you reach is one you have actually earned by sitting with the complexity rather than reaching for the easiest version of the story. Erik and Lyle Menendez are still alive. They are still in prison. Their case is still, as of this moment, unresolved. Jose and Kitty Menendez are not coming back, regardless of what happens next in any courtroom or parole hearing. Both of those facts deserve to be held with equal seriousness. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about this story. We will be here when the next chapter is written,